The moment I pulled into my own driveway and saw the boxes stacked against the garage door, I knew something had shifted in a way that couldn't be shifted back. They were my boxes. The ones I recognized from the top shelf of my bedroom closet, the green-lidded storage bins I'd used since Carol passed. Inside those bins were the last photographs of our life together. Her handwriting on index cards. A watch her father gave me the week before he died. Things that don't have a price but carry a weight that never leaves you. My son-in-law was standing in the doorway when I got out of the truck, arms crossed. That particular look on his face, the one I'd learned to recognize over 5 years of watching him make himself at home in a house that was not his. "We needed the room," he said. Not sorry. Not explaining. Just stating it. The way you'd tell someone the store was closed. I looked at the boxes. I looked at him. I said, "Those are my things. They're in the garage." He said, "There's plenty of space in there." I had built that house with my own hands. Not metaphorically. I mean, I poured the foundation with 2 neighbors and a rented mixer in the summer of 1987. I framed the walls. I ran the electrical in the east wing myself, because I didn't trust the quote the contractor gave me. I knew every crooked nail, every corner, where the drywall never quite sat flush. I had lived in that house for 37 years. I had buried a wife from that house. I had raised a daughter in that house, and my son-in-law had just moved my belongings into the garage to make room for his father. I didn't say anything else that afternoon. I picked up one of the boxes, carried it back inside, set it on the kitchen table, and went to sit in the living room. My son-in-law followed me in. He stood there for a moment like he was waiting for a fight that wasn't coming the way he expected. "My dad needs a proper room," he said. "He's got a bad back. He can't keep sleeping on the couch." I want you to understand something about where I was at that point in my life. I was 63 years old. I had retired from 30 years as a structural engineer 2 years earlier. I had spent my career understanding how things were built, and more importantly, how they came apart. I knew that structures don't fail all at once. They fail through accumulation. A crack here, a settling there, a joint that was never quite right, slowly giving way under load. My daughter and her husband had moved in 5 years earlier. It was supposed to be temporary. They'd had a rough stretch. His business had stumbled. They'd lost their rental. And my daughter called me in tears one Sunday afternoon, asking if they could stay a few months while they got back on their feet. I said yes, the way any father says yes, without conditions, without a timeline. I actually enforced. The few months became a year. The year became 2, then 3. And somewhere in that 3rd year, something in my son-in-law changed. Or maybe it had always been there, and I'd just been too willing to look past it. He stopped saying thank you. He stopped asking. He started deciding. He decided which TV shows ran in the living room in the evenings. He decided where the new couch went when the old one wore out. A new couch he bought with money I didn't ask about and didn't offer. He decided the back bedroom would be his office. That was my workroom. I had a drafting table in there. Old blueprints. Reference books. I moved them to the basement without making a scene because my daughter looked at me with those eyes she'd had since she was 7 years old, and I never could hold a line against them. That should have been the moment. That was the moment I should have said enough. Instead, I told myself it was temporary. I told myself he was under stress. I told myself that keeping the peace was worth more than the principle of the thing. What I didn't understand then, what I understand completely now, is that there is no keeping the peace with a person who reads your patience as weakness. Every time I stepped back, he stepped forward. It was not malice in the traditional sense. It was something simpler, and in some ways worse. He genuinely believed that because I allowed it, it was allowed. He had rewritten the story of our arrangement in his own mind until he was the protagonist of the house, and I was a peripheral character who happened to be paying the mortgage. Now he was standing in my living room, telling me his father needed a proper room. Where am I supposed to sleep? I asked. He shrugged. An actual shrug. The garage has the daybed from the spare room. It's not bad out there. We put a space heater. It was November. I looked at my daughter. She was standing at the edge of the hallway. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor. That was the second crack. The one that told me the structure was no longer repairable. I said I needed to make a phone call. I went to my bedroom, the room I had shared with Carol for 29 years. The room where she died on a Tuesday morning in March, with the window light coming in sideways, and I sat on the edge of what had been our bed, and I made a phone call. Not to my daughter, not to my son-in-law, to a man named Douglas, who had been my college roommate for 2 years and was now a family law and property attorney in the same city I'd lived in for 4 decades. Douglas picked up on the second ring. I need to talk to you, I said. Not as a friend, as a client. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, tell me what's going on. I told him. All of it. The 5 years. The office room. The new couch. The garage. The space heater. His father asleep in my bedroom before I'd even agreed to any of it. When I finished, Douglas said, are you on the deed? It's my house. I said, sole owner. No one else is on anything. Do they pay rent? Do you have any written agreement? No. Good, he said. That actually simplifies things considerably. Call me tomorrow morning, and I'll walk you through the next steps. In the meantime, and I want you to hear this clearly, do not give them any money. Do not sign anything. Do not let any conversation get heated in a way that could later be characterized as threatening. Just be calm and normal, and let me do the work. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in that room for a long time. The window was getting dark. The radiator clicked the way it had clicked for 15 winters. On the nightstand there was still the small framed photograph of Carol at Lake Tahoe in 1994. Squinting into the sun. Laughing at something I'd said that I couldn't remember anymore. I picked it up and held it. I am not a man who cries easily, but I sat there in the half-dark holding that photograph, and I felt something break loose in my chest that I hadn't let move in a long time. Not grief exactly. Grief. I knew how to carry. This was something different. This was the feeling of having loved people and trusted people and given everything you had to give, and having it turned into something small and easy to ignore. I set the photograph down. I straightened my back. I had spent my career understanding how to dismantle structures carefully, methodically, without drama. You don't blow up a building in the middle of a neighborhood. You identify the load-bearing points. You work from the outside in. You make sure that when it comes down exactly where you want it. I knew what I had to do, and I knew how to do it. The next morning I called Douglas at 8. He laid out the process. Because there was no lease, no written agreement, no exchange of rent. They were considered guests, or in legal terms, licensees, not tenants. That changed the eviction timeline considerably. In our state, I could issue a formal, written notice requiring them to vacate. Douglas prepared the paperwork. He also advised me to document the current state of the house photographs of every room, the garage, the new furniture they'd brought in. Everything. I walked through every room with my phone that morning while my son-in-law was at whatever it was he did during the day. My daughter was there. She watched me photograph the master bedroom, where his father was now sleeping in my bed, wearing my sheets, his medications arranged on my nightstand. She watched me photograph the garage with the daybed shoved against the wall and the space heater on an extension cord. Dad, she said, what are you doing? I'm documenting my property. I said, that's all. She bit her lip. She looked like she wanted to say something. She didn't. I want to pause here and tell you something about my daughter. Because this story isn't really about her being a villain. She is not a villain. She is a woman who married a man who was charming and confident when she was young, and who spent the years that followed slowly becoming someone else. And she had bent herself around him so gradually that she couldn't see how far she'd moved from where she started. I had watched it happen. I had said small things over the years, gentle things, and she had deflected them with the particular exhaustion of a person who has already had that argument 1,000 times in their own head and doesn't have the energy to have it out. Loud. She was not my enemy, but she was not protecting me either. And at 63 years old, I had finally accepted that those were not the only two options. Douglas delivered the formal notice 3 days later. He came himself, which I hadn't asked him to do but was grateful for. He was calm and professional, and when my son-in-law opened the door and saw the envelope, the look on his face was the first genuinely satisfying thing I had experienced in a long time. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't a question. A notice to vacate. Douglas said, "Mr. Harlan is exercising his rights as sole property owner. You have 30 days to arrange alternative housing. The notice includes the relevant statute and my contact information. If you have questions..." My son-in-law looked at me over Douglas's shoulder. I met his eyes. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the document didn't already say more cleanly. He turned back to Douglas. "He can't do this." "He can," Douglas said pleasantly. "He has. My contact information is on page 2. The 30 days were not quiet. I want to be honest about that. There were evenings when voices were raised. There were nights I sat in the kitchen at 2 in the morning because the house felt like a held breath that hadn't released yet. My son-in-law called me names through a closed door that I won't repeat here. He told my daughter I was destroying the family. He called Douglas's office 4 times. Douglas called me after the 4th call and said, "He's trying to negotiate. Don't negotiate." I didn't negotiate. I want to tell you about the night my daughter came and sat across from me at the kitchen table. It was about 2 weeks into the 30 days. It was late, and the house was quiet, and she looked like she hadn't slept in several days. Which I knew because I also hadn't slept in several days, and I recognized the look. She said, "I'm sorry." "Dad?" I looked at her. I waited. I let this go too far. She said, "I knew when he moved us into your workroom that it was too far." I told him. He said, "You didn't mind. I should have asked you directly. I should have asked you a lot of things directly." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "You're my daughter." I said, "That doesn't change. What happens with him that's between you and him? But I need my house back. I need to be able to live in my own home." She nodded. She was crying quietly. She said, "I know. Where will you go?" I asked. She had thought about it. She said, her friend Patrice had a guest room. She was going to stay there while she figured things out. She said that quietly, in a way that told me she had been thinking about more than just the next month. She had been thinking about a longer reckoning she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I hugged her before she went to bed. I held on for a moment longer than I usually did, the day they left. It was cold and gray. A flat November sky that made everything look like a photograph of itself. My son-in-law loaded a moving truck with the focused efficiency of a man who was angry and had nowhere to put it. He didn't speak to me. He didn't look at me. His father, who I had met exactly 3 times, shuffled past me in the doorway and said, "Sorry about all this," in a voice so small I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. When the truck pulled out of the driveway, I stood on the porch and watched it go. The house was quiet, in a way it hadn't been in 5 years. Not empty quiet. The difference between a room that has no one in it and a room that has been returned to itself. I went inside. I walked through every room. I opened windows, even though it was cold. I stood in my bedroom doorway and looked at the stripped bed and the bare nightstand, and I thought, this is mine. This is still mine. The walls I built, the floors I refinished, the window that looks out over the yard where Carol planted the rose bed in 1998, that still comes back every spring without anyone tending it. I called Douglas and thanked him. He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like I can breathe again." That winter was the quietest I'd had in years, and I want to tell you it was peaceful. And mostly it was, but I'll also tell you it wasn't without its hard nights. There is a particular silence that comes with a house after it has been full, not the peaceful silence of solitude, but the loud silence of absence. On some evenings I sat with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table and felt the full weight of the fact that Carol was gone, and my daughter was gone. And I was 63 years old in a house that was mine completely, and that fact felt both like a victory and like something else I didn't have a word for yet. My daughter and I talked on the phone. Slowly, then more regularly. She was still at Patrice's. She had started seeing a counselor. She said things were becoming clearer. She didn't tell me what was happening with her husband, and I didn't ask. But she sounded, over those months, gradually more like herself. Like the version of herself I had known before, the weight of him had settled over her. In February, a neighbor 2 streets over named Ruth stopped me in the parking lot of the hardware store. I had known her peripherally for years. She had been widowed about 4 years before Carol passed. We had exchanged sympathy cards at the time, run into each other at neighborhood events. She had a directness about her that I had always appreciated and mostly avoided because it made me feel like I had to be honest back. She said, "I heard you went through some things last fall. Word gets around." I said, "I heard you handled it well." She said, "Douglas handled it." I said, "I just didn't get in the way." She laughed. She had a good laugh. Not a polished laugh, a real one. We ended up talking in that parking lot for 40 minutes. I don't remember how the conversation went, only that it moved without effort, the way conversations sometimes do when you're with a person who doesn't require you to manage yourself around them. She mentioned she was redoing her kitchen and had a question about load-bearing walls. I told her what I knew. She mentioned she'd been meaning to ask someone for 2 years. I said I could take a look if she wanted. She said that would be fine. I looked at the kitchen. Then we had coffee. Then it was March, and the rose bed came back the way it always did. And Ruth was in my kitchen more mornings than not. And I looked at that rose bed one morning through the window, and I thought Carol would have liked her. I don't know exactly how to explain what the last year has been, except to say that I feel like a man who was standing in his own house not recognizing it, and who now stands in the same house and recognizes it completely, including the parts that have changed. My daughter filed for separation in April. She told me over the phone in a voice that was tired but steady. She said, "I should have done this years ago." I told her I was proud of her. She cried a little. So did I. She came to dinner in May. She and Ruth sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours while I grilled on the back porch, which is something I hadn't done since Carol was alive, because there had always seemed like a reason not to. I listened to their voices through the screen door, and the sound of it did something to the tight place in my chest that had been tight for a long time. I want to be clear about something before I finish telling you this. I am not telling you this story because everything worked out, and that makes it a good story. I am telling you this because for 5 years, I chose accommodation over clarity. And I called that love. And it wasn't. It was fear dressed up as patience. I was afraid of conflict. I was afraid of my daughter's disappointment. I was afraid that if I held a line, I would lose something I couldn't get back. What I didn't understand is that I was already losing it. The line between love and loss isn't drawn at the moment you set a boundary. It's drawn long before that. In all the small moments where you let something pass because it was easier By the time my son-in-law told me to sleep in my own garage, the house had already been taken. The process had started years earlier. One unchallenged assumption at a time. What I know now, at 64, is this: a structure stands because its foundations hold. The moment you allow the foundations to be compromised slowly, quietly, without drama, you are not keeping the peace. You are deferring the collapse. And when it comes, and it always comes, you either had a plan or you didn't. I had Douglas. I had 37 years of understanding how things are built and how they're taken apart. I had a bedroom where Carol's photograph still sits on the nightstand. And I had, slowly, carefully, without raising my voice, taken back every square foot of what was mine. My son-in-law called me once, about 6 months after they left. I don't know what he expected. He started talking about how things had gotten out of hand, how stress does things to people, how he thought we could start fresh. I listened to the whole thing. When he finished, I said, "I wish you well. I genuinely do. But we don't have anything further to discuss." And I ended the call. Douglas told me later that was the exact right response. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing loud, no confrontation, no ultimatum delivered in anger, just the quiet, unhurried execution of a plan while the other person is still waiting for you to react the way you always have before. Last Thanksgiving, for the first time in 6 years, I cooked in my own kitchen. My daughter came. Ruth came. Ruth's son drove up from Atlanta and turned out to be exactly the kind of person you'd hope. Someone's son would be easy and funny and unguarded in that particular way of people who grew up in a house with a good mother. We ate at the table I had built in 1991 from reclaimed oak that I'd gotten from a demolition site in Tacoma. I had made that table for Carol. It had held 28 Thanksgivings before this one. It was still level, still solid, built to last, because I had known, even then, that the things that matter should be built to last. After dinner, my daughter helped me clear the dishes, and we stood at the sink together the way we had when she was a teenager, and she said, without looking up, "I miss this." "I know." I said, "So did I." Outside the window, the rose bed was bare in the November dark. But it would come back in April. It always came back in April. I was home,